Welcome everyone. Bonjour tout le monde. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar on data, learning, and COVID-19. My name is Ina Shalala. I'm the Director of Learning and Partnerships at Philanthropic Foundations Canada, PFC. To begin, we would like to acknowledge the many territories of Turtle Island, Canada, on which we work and reside. These territories, ceded and unceded, are home to many Indigenous peoples who have lived here for tens of thousands of years and continue to live here. As settlers, immigrants, and descendants, and as visitors, we honor and respect the many Indigenous peoples of this land and territory and hope for a more just future together. So we have the pleasure to have a great panel today and to introduce you to Stacey Macdonald. Hi, Stacey. Stacey is the Learning and Evaluation Specialist at the Ontario Trillium Foundation, where she has spent the past 9 years leading evaluation, research, and learning projects. She is also currently working with the Foundation's Partnership Investment Team and is co-leading a partnership with the PFC to engage funders in developing a data strategy. Charles, hi Charles. Charles Baudry is Director of Impact Hub in Montreal. Charles leads the development and coordination of an intersectoral ecosystem of organizations that aim to accelerate progress and measurement of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, through the implementation of innovative approaches and solutions. And finally, our third panelist, Ben Liatsky. Hi, Ben. Ben is a program manager at the Counseling Foundation of Canada and a research consultant at Taylor Newberry Consulting. Ben has more than 10 years of experience in the nonprofit sector in a variety of roles, from evaluation to program management to communications. Hello, everyone, and thank you for being with us today. Before we jump into the conversation, just a little housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions during the discussions at any time, we invite you to type them into the Q&A box at the bottom center of your screen. And we will try to answer your questions as much as possible during the Q&A period at the end of the webinar. Also, just to let you know that the webinar is being recorded, you will receive a follow-up message after the webinar, which will include a short evaluation survey, as well as the webinar recording and some complementary resources that our panelists have shared with us. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our panelists. We know how much the COVID-19 crisis has been challenging for everyone, including for foundations who have been called upon to respond nimbly and quickly to a rapidly changing situation. The current context has also highlighted data and learning gaps for all actors involved in responding to the crisis, including governments, but also foundations. So the question is how foundations can and should respond or make decisions without necessarily having the full picture at any one time. PFC, jointly with other networks, have developed 5 guiding principles to assist foundations in supporting their grantees. So the question we're going to answer today, or try to answer today through this conversation with our panelists, is really how do we operationalize these principles within this context of data gaps and some learning gaps as well. So we invite our panelists to help us navigate through it all, and I'll start with Stacey. Stacey, in your own perspective, what has the current crisis highlight about the data needs in your foundation? Stacey.
Thanks, Inez. So, when the pandemic, when it became clear that there were going to be some serious consequences in Canada, that this was coming to Canada, and that we were trying to understand what was happening, our first reaction was, we need to understand how is this going to affect us? What information do we need to help us understand what's going to happen? How is it going to affect our province, our communities, our sectors, our partners, the organizations we work with? And so answering that question was challenging. It was challenging because the information that we collect isn't necessarily the right information to answer those questions in a real-time, meaningful way to be able to respond. And so we had to look at a lot of external data sources to complement what we were hearing from our grantees. My colleague Sandra was tasked with trying to pull together sources and kind of make a clear picture of what was going on. And it's difficult because the nonprofit sector doesn't have a lot of great real-time data about what is happening. And so we had to work a lot with our partners. We had to have conversations with people in our networks. We relied on different sources of data like ONN, Flash Survey, and the Ontario 211 network that was collecting local needs data based on their call data. So trying to get a picture of what was happening from all these very disparate, fragmented pieces of data, people asking similar but not the same questions from similar but not the same people. And so that's a challenge. And then trying to make sense of, okay, not only what's happening in communities, but then what are other funders doing? What's our role in the landscape? And so trying to figure out, like, if we're going to respond, how can we best respond? When we looked at all the data from our what we were hearing from our grantees, from our networks, from doing searches about what are others learning even from other countries and jurisdictions, then it became clear that a lot of the responses at the beginning were focused on immediate needs, and not thinking yet about recovery. And so that journey of looking at the data that was available to us led us to recognize that to meet the demands of communities, the needs of communities, that is going to have to happen through, in large part, the nonprofit sector, that they play a very important role, organizations that we work with. And so they're going to need support. And so what we're in the process right now of finalizing the details of recovery fund, and we're looking to redirect the remaining $80 million of our current community investments from grow and capital streams to a recovery fund. So that should be announced soon. And so I guess when I think of everything that I just said, the experience has made clear that while we do a pretty good job of collecting data about our grants, that when there's this kind of crisis, we need to look beyond our grant data, beyond to other partners, to what's going on, and that we need to do that with others. We can't respond to the crisis on our own, and so to be able to respond to that in, if not a coordinated way, then at least kind of side by side working with others, then we need to think about establishing mechanisms or channels to better collect and exchange data and information amongst ourselves in a timely and consistent way.
Very interesting. And I guess what you're saying really makes me think about the time needed to collect all that information, to consult with other funders, with your grantees. And then, the foundations are challenged to respond quickly. So, there's a tension there that needs to be addressed and tackled. Ben, what about you? What from your perspective, what are your early learnings or about the context and the situation?
Yeah, very similar to Stacey. And first, I'll just say thanks for having me as part of this webinar. I think for us at the foundation, sort of three different data needs, I would say, came into play. The first was just on a very human level. We needed to know if our grantees were okay as people, the people there working, the staff. The question of how are you doing took on new meaning during this pandemic, and that's something we were very conscious of trying to understand at a human level how people were handling this. And then similarly, how the clients and participants that our grantees serve, how they were doing and what they were hearing from them. So one of our sort of data needs that we needed early on was just really to check in with people and see how things were going. In particular, one of the things that we were wary of is, I don't know about other foundations, but we didn't have a global pandemic in our strategic plan. So we needed advice. We weren't sure, quite what would be a response that would be helpful in the moment. So we are asking our grantees, and we're asking people, what are your top priorities? What is the most urgent need? What stage are you at in terms of deciding whether programming is going to continue? And if it continues, what do you need to make that happen? So we were asking these types of questions. So that was the first data need. The second was, I think at a larger scale, very similar to what Stacey mentioned, about what was going on in the sector more broadly. So understanding, things like the survey data that ONN did, or Imagine Canada more recently, or other intermediaries like the Alberta Nonprofit Network or the Saskatchewan Nonprofit Partnership, all these intermediaries that have done really important work to gather information about their members in their sector, about how this pandemic is affecting the ability of nonprofits and charities to survive and continue to work. And it unfortunately, the information coming back is very bleak. It's really highlighting just what a challenge it is this pandemic is presenting, and the need for foundations to respond, in new ways and important ways. So that was the second thing, is just gathering data from outside sources that was at a higher level of what's going on more broadly. Mm-hmm. And then lastly, we knew we're one funder, we're not a huge funder by any means, so we can't do everything ourselves, but we do know that there are a lot of funders who, similar to us, and Stacey mentioned this as well, who are looking to take action right now and looking to be responsive. And so we're talking a lot to other funders, and we're seeing who's interested and who are hearing similar things from their grantees as us. And so we're pursuing a lot of these conversations and seeing where they're going around how we might work together. So things like we're looking at our loan program with Alterna Savings, for instance. An Indigenous Resilience Fund has been another one that a number of funders have come to discuss. And we're sort of exploring where those conversations are going right now, and some are hopefully coming to fruition soon. So we're hopeful that we can take action in that respect, as well as what we can do on our own. So those are the three things that I think were really different for us in this pandemic.
Thank you, Ben. Very interesting. And so from Charles, we wanted really to hear about the perspective of civil society organization and what your take is on this, on data needs and the data gaps that you need to address and manage during the current situation. What can you share with us to help enlighten foundations from a different perspective?
Yes, well, first of all, thank you for having me, Ines. It's a real pleasure to be part of the panel with Stacey and Ben. Maybe before I share more, just a bit of context on the voices I represent on this panel. So I'm leading the Impact Hub chapter in Quebec and Montreal. And we're a global community that is helping impact entrepreneurs, a lot of civil society organizations, social entrepreneurs that are addressing the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So our raison d'être, the reason we exist as a global association in over 100 cities in 50 countries, is to enable people who have solutions to make our world a better place, have access to knowledge, have access to resources, and to implement those ideas in the long term. So the pandemic for us has been tricky on two levels, given that we are community builders, we are ecosystem builders for impact around the world. And really, we've been looking at how our members are doing. So I liked what Ben said about the first thing we did is check in with people, because for us, knowing how our members or the people that have the solutions felt was really important. And the second aspect is more on the systemic level. So I think the crisis presents an opportunity, as Stacey said, to think beyond our own wall and think in the long term. So we did a few actions to gather data in order to respond to the needs of our global members. So to put that in numbers, it's around 20,000 social entrepreneurs that we support around the globe. Fortunately, we have been accustomed in generating data on the Sustainable Development Goals, on the impact areas that our members are targeting. So we were able to fast track the data process on knowing what were the immediate needs of our impact entrepreneurs. And obviously it's not a surprise in that crisis that the primary concern, even for us as a global network, but for the people that we serve, was access to financing and to resources. So I think that in this conversation, the perspective is interesting from the Impact Hub lens as kind of an intermediary that is allowing some grantees to have a better access or knowledge of what's the landscape around the COVID-19 crisis. So that was on a solutions level. So we partnered with different global foundations to create an online dashboard where our impact entrepreneurs could immediately turn to in order to understand what is the immediate short-term resources and partnerships that they can tap into. So that was with the Skoll Foundation and the Schwab Foundation. So we have an online market where our entrepreneurs can tap into. And then the second aspect, so maybe more on a Canadian level and ecosystem, is that even though the crisis is a really hard moment for impact entrepreneurs and solutions holder, it still presents an opportunity in our view to propose a new collaboration approach on how we see investment making, granting making for people who have solutions and to have this long-term vision. So that's where we bring the perspective of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals as kind of a common language that we can share beyond the wall of the philanthropic sector, but also with civil society organizations and with governments. So that has been our thoughts the past few weeks.
Great, thanks, Charles. Charles, not Charles, sorry. So we wanted to shift the conversation into a more solution-oriented, and I think Charles just mentioned this. And so I wanted to go to ask you a question about, what would be your 2 or 3 top recommendations to share with, funders participating in this webinar, from the, based on the early learnings that you've, and the context setting that you've just shared. I'm very curious to know, what your insights are. And so I'll start with Ben this time, perhaps. Ben, I know, so you do wear a double hat today. So not only are you working with the Counseling Foundation of Canada, but you're also a consultant on evaluation and learning. And we've worked with you recently to develop this toolkit about evaluation practices in times of crisis, which will be released next week. And so what have you learned in the process of working on this, publications, but also more generally with your experience within the foundation you work in?
Yeah, it's been a very interesting project to work on, and a number of insights have come out of that. So, first off, the idea that things are different now and foundations are working in very new ways is, I think, true for a lot of foundations, but it's not true for everyone. So some foundations, I think, have already done the types of things that PFC has been calling for instance, in its joint statement with CFC and Environment Funders Canada and the Circle around, being more responsive and, making decisions a bit more quickly and being flexible with things like reporting requirements. Some of these things have been called on in the philanthropic sector by others for a long time. So I think it's worth acknowledging that some of these new practices have actually been around for a while. But aside from that, I think the other thing is just recognizing that there is so much new information coming into foundations and so much to process and so much to deal with, that a key ingredient, and I have a couple of slides here to sort of speak to this, is really has to do with the learning culture. So you can have a great evaluation plan and have a great evaluation report, for instance, but if you haven't enabled the conditions to actually implement whatever comes out of that evaluation report, then it's not really going to do a whole lot of good. So building up that learning culture, I think, is really important. And that term learning culture, I think, is not always an easy thing to grasp. It sort of sounds a bit fluffy or not well defined. But in the research that I did with my colleague at Taylor Newberry Consulting prior to this work that I've done with PFC, we looked at what it means to have a learning culture and have more of a learning relationship with grantees. And some of the insights were, organizations that do have strong learning cultures really do ask themselves deep questions. They're not just program or tactical questions. They're really about the values and assumptions of what they want to do, how they want to make change. So for instance, a lot of foundations now are creating new application forms that are simpler and easier to use. And it's worth asking, well, what was the reason behind that? What is the underlying assumption for having a really long application form, for instance? And do you need that going forward, or might this more simpler process be something that sticks? Another one is engaging more with partners. And I think a lot of foundation staff are doing this. They're speaking more to their grantees, they're speaking more to other funders. They're asking questions. They're not coming into conversations to just share information in sort of a one-directional way. It's more of a brainstorming or co-designing or just seeing where things are going to go conversation. And there's really this sort of commitment to act. So it's not just about gathering information for the sake of gathering information. It's wanting to act on it, being able to take that information and turn it into action. And lastly, that leadership is really key. And if leaders, executive directors, CEOs, boards, and so forth aren't really committed to action, to hearing from different voices, then things tend to get stuck. So that's a real barrier. And so when all these things are there, the deep questions, a commitment to acting, including different voices and leaderships at the table, you start to have elements of what a strong learning culture means, and that can enable better evaluation going forward. So we can go to the next slide. And so that also sort of means that different skills are maybe necessary than before. So while it's great to have people that are good at designing logic models or surveys, to be good at having a learning culture, you need things like good facilitation and listening skills, being able to share and talk about when things aren't working well, being able to combine lots of information. And Stacey spoke to that a little bit off the top about her colleague, gathering information from ONN and from other partners and so on and so forth in order to get a bigger picture of what's going on. And then building a culture of learning isn't, just a professional development opportunity that you can decide to do, later on for some staff, maybe when times are better. It's really a core element of the work. And that means you have to resource it properly and create time for things like reflection and asking the deep questions and all those sorts of key elements of learning organizations. And so those are just a few of the ideas. And on the last slide that I have, was just a couple of resources that at Taylor Newberry that we've actually developed to kind of operationalize and make these things a bit more tangible. So one is a self-assessment tool, and one is a bit more of a guide with some principles and so forth that I am both plugging, but also trying to make the point that this idea of a learning culture isn't this fluffy thing. There is some good research out there. There is some tangible actions and next steps and ideas to help make this something that you can do in your organization. I'll stop there.
Yes, thanks. I just took 1 second because my son was making noise in the background, so I wanted him to stop. Thank you for this, and thank you also for sharing these resources. I just want to remind the participants that all of these links will be shared in a resource package that we're developing for you and shared after the webinar. Shao, from your perspective, what have been, well, actually, let's go to Stacey first, because I think it's a good link to what Ben has been saying. Stacey, some key learnings or recommendations that you would like to share with the foundations?
Yes. I think similar to what a lot of people have been saying, this crisis has, I think, underlined things that we were already thinking about already, and underline the importance of them. And one of those things is exactly what Ben was talking about, having a learning culture and being more intentional, I think, with the data that we're collecting and thinking really deeply about what we're collecting, why we're collecting, from whom, for what purpose, and really thinking through that, what happened, so what, and now what? What are we going to do about it? Kind of cycle of action. So not just collecting data, but making sure that everything we collect is done with intentionality, with purpose. And so one of the things that we've been thinking about, and that is even more, I think, important now, is to do a data audit at OTF. So we're going to look at everything we collect. We're going to be really clear about what we want to use it for, what questions we want to be able to answer, and then maybe let go of things that aren't serving us. Look at, are there certain groups that are being left out of data collection, and how can we better collect data thinking of those groups, of equity in our grant making, and better leverage the data that we already collect. So I think OTF, like a lot of other foundations, collect a lot of qualitative text-based data. And so we need to think really carefully about, what we collect, what can we learn from that, what are we doing with that? And I think that kind of segues into the next thing, in that we need to think kind of ahead of what is it that we want to learn from all of this data. So we have data that we use on, like, internally decision making for reporting, but also we're in a privileged position that we collect a lot of data from a lot of organizations, and we're asking ourselves questions about what can we learn from that, and related to this crisis, what can we learn about our response, what's happening to the organizations that we work with. Like Ben mentioned, all of our program managers are reaching out to the organizations that they're working with and trying to understand, what supports are needed, if grants are needing extensions, or to be put on hold for a while, and then looking at what is happening there, why, if we can learn anything more deeply about how to respond to crisis and how to do that better for maybe next time, and what can we learn about building a new, more resilient nonprofit sector. And so we're looking at thinking about what are those learning questions, and building our own internal data and learning culture. And so I had a little sneak peek at this resource that Ben was working on for you for PFC, and it is really great, has really great resources, and I'm looking forward to using it. And then also the importance of being nimble, of building systems that can adapt to changing needs, and needs are always changing. And so thinking ahead on how we collect, for example, outcome data from our grantees. And right now we're looking at, our measurement approach and how we need to build in more flexibility. And that is more apparent now than ever. The other thing that I think we learned is that relationships are so important. And relationships with other funders, with our partners, with the organizations that we work with, and that no one foundation, government, organization can respond on their own. And so we're looking at how we can work together with others to respond to our data needs, and to better capture what can be learned during this time. And so one of the things that we're working with PFC on, as mentioned it in my bio, is this partnership on engaging funders in developing a data strategy. So, we're not the only funders that have challenges with accessing good quality, fulsome data in a real-time way to make decisions that want to collect higher quality outcome data from our investments to understand what's happening. And so I think, you know, now more than ever, it's clear that we need to work together on that and to share the information that we're learning and to make best use of available data and research assets. So we're having conversations with MyTax, which provides a connection between academic researchers and nonprofits, different academic partners, organizations like the Ontario Nonprofit Network, thinking how together we can try to answer some of the questions that we have in a coordinated way. And you know, one last thing is looking at, I said assets that are currently available. So things like the community data program and the data that is available there. And so just trying to understand more about the landscape and who can we engage with and who can we work together with in moving this work along together. Yeah.
Thanks, Stacey. Jacques, any perspectives on this question? And maybe how do you think the Sustainable Development Goals can provide that framework or help answer our common challenge right now, which is a lot about you know, sharing data, funder collaboration, etc. What are your ideas about this?
Yeah, well, I'll start by saying that I like the concept of a learning culture. I think one point I'd like to emphasize on with the SDGs lens is, could we create a collective learning culture? In that today we're really focused on discussing from the philanthropic perspective, and the approach, to use your word, Stacey, that I really like is, how can we create a coordinated way to better do it? So the SDGs, just a little bit of background for those who are new to this concept, because there's still a lot of awareness to build in Canada, but it's a framework that was adopted by the United Nations in 2015, and it provides us with a framework of an evolving framework. I like to use that word because it's not as rigid as one would think. It needs to be localized to our context, to our Canadian, Quebec, Montreal realities. So it's a framework adopted by 193 countries in 2015 that really is based on a common language that across the world we can work collaboratively across sector to achieve a set of ambitious goals by year 2030, from ending poverty to ending hunger to combat climate change. And so relating to this discussion, I think what is key around the SDGs is that they provide this framework of coordination on how we can bring the voice of the philanthropic side in collaboration with decisions that are taken at the public side in the civil society organizations that I represent, and ultimately the people who have the solutions on the field who are ready to implement them. I think the second part of it that we haven't touched yet on the webinar is really the impact measurement piece. So how are we ensuring that the projects that we support with mentoring, with financial resources or other, we're able to track that impact over a long period of time. And for me, the SDGs, they provide partially the answer to that answer, because it's really built on best global practices. And I have this open question since the beginning of the crisis, as we see exponential announcement of emergency packages on how are we ensuring that the decisions that we're taking today are aligned with long-term impact objectives. So kind of shifting this idea of what's the return on the investment of a decision to where's the return on the impact that we're going to have some years from now. And Ines, I prepared a small graph maybe to put in perspective the idea that I want to share with the group today about the notion of integrating and of transversal. So the graph that you see is just how the SDGs can all relate basically to the COVID-19 pandemic, which ultimately is the number one SDG is how are we missing good health and good health and well-being. Sorry, my English. But we do have an impact on a various number of SDGs. And one of my message to the group today is that the SDGs, we're all pretty much working already on some aspects of it, and it's not a rigid framework. It can be adapted, and we have tools that can help us doing it. But I think today really the number 16 SDG that relates to our discussion, which is the efficient institutions. So how are we actually collecting, reading, and transforming the knowledge on data into action? And for me, that's the key message today that I think the SDGs can bring into this phase of thinking about our future, is transforming the knowledge that we will gather, because there's not a lot of data yet available on the SDGs, but we can start with the crisis, I think.
Thanks, Charles. One question perhaps that just came in, and I would like to give you the opportunity perhaps to answer it now, is how can the SDG framework be used at the local level, Charles? How do you think we can actually translate those big goals, global goals, into something local and tangible that relates to us?
Well, I would say local, the first thing we need to look at is at the national level, because the SDGs, yes, it's a global framework, but it needs to be localized to our countries. So Canada has taken a leadership in the country to develop a national strategy on the SDGs and to develop a Canadian indicator framework on the SDGs that is applicable to a variety of sectors, And looking at that national strategy and indicators, it gets easier to understand what could be applied in a more local context. For example, my organization, we're looking at how are we creating effective partnerships with governments, with foundation, which is really number 17, but it's looking through the strategy that's been developed at a national scale.
All right, thanks. So we're taking questions now. We have a few coming into the Q&A box and the chat box, so I'll try to go over them and invite all the panelists to share their thinking. So one of the things I thought was a very, it's something that I always think about as well, is, you know, when we talk about data, how can, and we talk about hard data. You know, there's data that's that can be taken or gathered from intangible impacts of projects. And so one of the questions is, and I'm just, where is it? Here it is. It's actually in the chat box. So I invite all participants to put it in the Q&A box just to make sure that I have like a lineup of questions that's easier to find. So one of the questions is, the hardest data to collect is that which is unmeasurable. How is the flow of donor dollars impacting recipients from an emotional perspective? Are recipients happier, thriving emotionally, feeling supported? The measurable metrics are easy, but those metrics aren't the only ones that count. Any reaction from the panel about this point?
Hi, Inez.
Hi.
It's Stacey here. I think even some of these questions here, you know, when we talk data, it can be all kinds of different information that we collect. And yes, there's quantitative data, there's qualitative data, and we can answer these questions in a variety of different ways. I don't like, yes, there are things that are harder to collect data about and that are harder to measure, but I don't think that there are things that can't be done to mitigate that and to help that and to address that. So the questions, are recipients happier, thriving, emotionally, feeling supported? I think we can ask questions about all of those things from recipients, and depending on who they are and what the context is, maybe we want to do that in a different way. For some people, that could be a quantitative survey with, a question on a scale of how they're feeling, but other people that might have to be an interview. And I think when we're talking data, we need to open ourselves up to all the different types of available data out there and to take advantage of some advances in the past few years in trying to move beyond a set of very rigid metrics and to try to learn more from different types of data available.
Thanks, Stacey. Good point. Anyone else wants to jump in? All right. So we have many other questions. One of them, which is for Charles, about the SDGs. And the question is, are you aware of any larger research initiatives that are using SDGs as a framework for understanding the impact of COVID, nationally or globally?
Good question. So at the national level, I'm not aware of any larger initiatives that have been put in place. I think in Canada, we still have a lot of awareness building on the SDGs and the value added that it can bring to integrate data generation on COVID-19. The United Nations I think a month ago, April 14, they released a statement as to what action would be implemented in order to ensure that we're able to track progress relating to SDGs and the COVID-19 pandemic. So in terms of larger initiatives, I think the United Nations has put that up to the community to tap into. My personal view on this is that often we get those ideas out when you're a large organization such as the United Nations, but you need to have local organizations who can own what is put out there. So if it's a global framework that's been announced, we need to have some local leadership in Canada to say, well, maybe us too in our local context, well, we're able to track the impact of COVID-19 on our own local SDGs.
Thanks, Charles. Another question that comes from the participants is about one challenge we are facing at the moment is with research initiatives that we were in the middle of collecting data for, and then the COVID-19 crisis started. So what are your recommendations about how to treat data collected for these initiatives before versus after COVID-19 crisis as a critical incident?
Sure, I can take a stab at this first, at least. So I think it's a very good question, and I think a starting point would be, to go back to some of those initial research questions that you had around why you were collecting that data and what you're going to do with it, and see if those questions still hold up based on what data you have. Can you get maybe partial answers to some of those questions? Is there enough data that you can inform maybe some potential next steps already without having to do further data collection? If not, maybe you do have to wait until the crisis is over. Alternatively, it may be worth thinking about other ways that you can get answers to some of those questions if some of your current methodologies have been interrupted. So for instance, if you can't do a in-person focus group, but you still want to get information, is there a way that you can ask some of those questions virtually? Or can you look elsewhere? Has there been studies that might be a different location or a slightly different population group, but the question might be similar enough that you can get some data that could inform some of your thinking and help answer your research questions. So I think there's ways that you can still make use of the data that you've had by going back first to some of your questions in your evaluation framework and your research framework and asking what information do we know now? What do we still need to get? Where else can we maybe find information that can help us answer the questions we want to have answered? And it may mean that you might have to wait until this crisis has passed. It may mean that you can get by with sort of a good enough standard of rigor, as Michael Quinn-Patton, who's an evaluator, likes to say, where you can use the information you have to inform decisions and kind of say, this is the best we can do right now, and this is the knowledge we have. Or maybe you can, use some alternative methods to still do the same research you wanted, but via online tools instead.
Thanks, Ben. So one other question is about the challenges of data collection, especially in these times of crisis when everyone is already stretched thin. So what would your thoughts or advice be on supporting organizations to collect data when they're already stretched thin, or maybe more focused on operational priorities and emergencies that make it feel like collecting data is not possible, or maybe just isn't a priority right now?
I can jump in, Ines,
Sure.
with a very short answer, because it's something that we did with all of our members and the impact entrepreneurs that we serve. I think the key to gather data in times of crisis is it needs to be very explicit what will be the action that comes out from generating this data. So the use of what will be the follow-up actions from generating the data. I think if there is, if it can inform a better long-term collaboration, I think it's easier that way.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Anyone else wants to jump in for this question? So there's another question about, I think it's about some peer-to-peer learning. So someone is asking about and saying that they're about to launch a survey on the impact of COVID-19 on young people in general, and also in terms of their involvement in our non-formal education program. What would the funders be interested to know about the impact of COVID-19 questions on young people, which may not currently been covered by surveys so far? To Stacey's point in the beginning of the webinar. Any thoughts about this? Stacey?
Just reading over the question again. I mean, I guess I don't know is my first answer, because I'm not that familiar with what do we already know. So one of the things that we thought about briefly, should we, for example, do a survey of our grantees? And we decided no, there are a lot of surveys going around now, and could we get the information we needed from other sources? And if we could, then would we need to do another survey? And so I guess in terms of like what funders would be interested in, I always feel, and this may be strange answer from a funder, my first thought is like, what information do you need to know to do your work? Mm-hmm. And what information is most useful to you? And then think about the funder later. I don't know if that is terribly helpful, but, and then what information is already out there that others may have collected that's similar to, I think, Ben's answer, that can inform what you're doing instead of doing additional data collection. And then, maybe that question is not best asked to me, but of other funders that work specifically for youth. I don't work directly with OTF's Youth Opportunities Fund. And so I can't really answer from that perspective, but if there are other funders on the webinar right now that are more youth focused, then maybe they can chime in.
Ben?
So I mean, youth is largely the area that the Counseling Foundation focuses on, but sort of similar to Stacey's answer. You know, I think the place for me to start would be if you want to know what would be helpful for funders, it'd be to ask the funders that are working in the youth space what would be helpful to them, and sort of start there rather than we need data. Start with the question of, well, what are we going to do with this? Like, why should we be collecting this data in the first place? How will it help us inform action or for us to do our work better? So I think this is a good opportunity to reach out to other funders if that's who the target audience is for these results. It's in a really interesting time to see how funders are working together in all sorts of different ways. And if this is an opportunity to get some really helpful and useful data that you think would be valuable for lots of funders, and you have a sort of clear vision or idea for how that would come to be, I think reach out to other funders and see if this would be interesting, see how it might be interested before sort of committing to this path. So you don't have to go it alone, and so you can make the most of the information if it makes sense to gather it.
Yeah, just to add to that, I absolutely agree, Ben. I feel like now more than ever, there's so many conversations happening between funders. And I have so many colleagues. I know there are people from the Counseling Foundation. I think talking to some of my colleagues, there's so many conversations now that I think people are quite open to hearing what others are doing, are interested, how we can work together, how we can share information. So I would encourage that.
Great, thanks, Stacey. And I mean, my thinking is about this question is really on, you know, maybe also looking at the landscape of projects that are servicing youth or young people in non-formal education program, and really see what, you know, other funders are looking at. So that's a very good point. So there's a question about, I guess, applying an equity lens to data. You might not have all the answers, but I welcome your input. So the question is, how can we make sure that the data being collected does not discriminate against communities and respect the inclusivity and equity of groups when collecting, transforming, and reading this information? Any insights or ideas about thoughts about this?
I think this is a super tough question that could probably, Inez, you can devote a whole series of webinars on.
Correct.
But it's a really important question to ask right now, because as we're seeing the move of so much digital online service delivery, engagement, that we're hearing from organizations that there are people that are being kind of left out, that there are people that don't have access to computers, to internet, to reliable high-speed internet, and that is leaving some people out. There's also a lot of discussions around collecting race-based data and the importance of doing that. You know, the province of Ontario just announced that it was going to start collecting that related to health data, which it hadn't before, to follow, I think, the lead of Manitoba. And so I think we just need to keep asking ourselves these questions about what data we collect, who is missing from that data, and engage those people in the conversation. Engage different types of people to look at what are we missing, because, you know, it's hard for us to always see what's missing because our biases are just so ingrained that we just might not think of something from the same perspective as someone else. And so to, again, widen the range of the people that we engage with and involve moving forward.
Great. Ben, did you have something to share?
Yeah, I think Stacey actually said it very well, and also glad to see that that Stacey shared Heather Krause, who I think has some great ideas on how to do this well. But I think conceptualizing data is not something that is only for funders is a good place to start. Like when data is seen as an extractive exercise where you just ask questions and you take information and you maybe put it in a report that goes on a website, but where the people involved in the data process, the people that you're asking those questions are excluded from any sort of involvement in even things like the question design or analyzing those answers once they come out can create problems. So the more effort that is taken to really understand how you can involve all the stakeholders in a data process in that journey, I think the better. So think about can in the question design phase, can you have different stakeholders be involved in that, and what does that look like, and what's the appropriate way to involve those conversations, to when you're asking those questions, how are they being asked, who is asking them, to the analysis part of it, which is behind every data point can be a person. So keeping that in mind and recognizing that your perspective on what a finding might be may be very different from someone else's. So how do you involve different stakeholders in that process?
Thanks, Ben. I think we went through most of the questions. One question is related to the 3.5%. The question is, what do you think it might take for foundations or DAF holders to give more than just the minimum of 3.5% of their capital? And so I guess my question is, in return, is there data that actually shows that? So I just wanted to actually share with you the fact that we have developed a platform in collaboration with other networks such as the Circle, CFC, and EFC to collect data from funders about their response to COVID-19, the different projects and initiatives that they have undertaken. And we're currently collecting this information. The deadline to submit is May 20th for stage 1. And I think based on the results of this data collection effort, we will really have a bigger picture of how foundations have been responding to the crisis, what type of activities they have been doing, and also the collaboration between funders. I think that's also going to be highlighted by this platform. And I invite you to, I've actually included the links on the slides. If you are a PFC, EFC, CFC member, you might have already received the request from PFC, but I think CFC is sending it this end of this week. In any case, the links are going to be in the resource package that we will be sending you, and we really invite you to take part in this collective effort to really provide the bigger picture about what's going on with foundations and their responses to COVID-19. And about the question about, is this data going to be available? Yes, it is publicly available information and a platform, so everyone will be able to access it. So just before we sort of close the webinar, I think it was a very, very interesting conversation, and a lot of ideas, have come out. And I actually was thinking that I might need to re-listen to the conversation to make sure I don't, miss anything. But one of the things I guess I would like to give participants is like a main takeaway that they can take home with them, for immediate action. So if you were, one of the funders and you had one piece of advice to give, what would it be? And maybe we'll start with Stacey.
Piece of advice. I think I already shared it. I think if you're a funder on the call or an organization, whoever, reach out to someone else. If you're thinking about these things, how can I collect better data? How can I get access to more reliable data? What data is available out there? I think so many of us are asking these questions, and let's work together to figure it out instead of just wondering on our own. So reach out to someone else and start the conversation.
Thanks, Stacey. Ben?
I think my advice would be, if you're a funder who's doing things in a new way and you're being more responsive and more adaptable and more flexible, to really think about that process that led you to that new way of working, to really try and capture those lessons learned, and to ask yourself, when this is all said and done and we're past this COVID-19 crisis, do you want to go back to that situation where you had longer application forms and lots of reporting requirements, and you didn't talk as much to your grant recipients or your funders? I'm not saying that's all the funders that are out there now, but I think certainly that would be the case for some. So to really think about the process that you're in right now, of operating differently and what that means, and to try and understand how you got there and how you might keep some of those things.
Thanks, Ben. Charles, final thoughts?
Thanks for keeping it last. I echo Stacey and Ben's point. I think the time is now for greater coordination and greater collaboration. I think my key insight is that whatever, if you're a funder or an organization, if you're providing data or collecting data on the short term to prepare a response or an action, we need to think about the long-term impact and how it will affect future generations and youth also, since it's one of our topic. So thinking long-term as we initiate a recovery.
Thanks, Charles. Very, very good point. I just wanted, before we wrap up and close, I just wanted to answer one last question about this platform. And the question is about the geographical data in terms of where the funds are invested and where the funder is located, and it's yes to both questions. So I just wanted to thank you all for participating and taking part in this webinar. It was really interesting. I look forward to working more with each of you in the near future. I also wanted to remind participants to subscribe or sign up to our weekly digest on the PFC website to receive more information about upcoming webinars and resources that can support you in your work. We do have a COVID-19 dedicated page and a lot of interesting resources on there. So next week's webinar will focus on the indigenous perspectives and solutions and in times of crisis. And the one, I think it's June 3rd, is on managing endowments in times of crisis. And so very different topics, but very relevant to our community of funders. So I invite you to sign up to both. And please don't forget to respond to the short survey that we will be circulating, and we will be sending it together with recording, the link to the recording of the webinar, additional resources that were mentioned during this conversation, and the slide deck. And to Stacey, Ben, and Charles, thank you so much for taking the time. I know that in times of crisis, time is sort of spread thin, and you still agreed to participate. So I really appreciate it. Thank you. And I'll hope to talk to you soon. And thanks again for joining us today. And we will see you next time. Thanks.